Hello and welcome to Mind Matters, an invitation to well-being. I'm Sohila Bajaj. In an endeavor to highlight the importance of mental health, create awareness, eliminate stigma, and increase mental health literacy, we join forces with experts to understand the various facets of mental illness and highlight brave people who are ready to narrate their journey of hope. With this special broadcast, we also endeavor to encourage more people to come forward and seek help when needed. Today, we try and navigate the complexities of grief. Grief is a natural response to loss, the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. This loss can be of any kind: the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship, or even a subtle loss. Grief or the pain caused by this loss can be overwhelming and can also disrupt physical health, making it difficult to eat, sleep, or think straight. Grief is both universal and a personal experience. Yet, there is often a timeline given to grieving, and this can often mean that it goes unresolved. There is no correct way to grieve. And yet, because of certain pressures that society puts, many leave it unacknowledged, and this then becomes a cause for other mental illnesses. Today, in an effort to understand grief better, we speak to Dr. Shyam, psychiatrist, integrative medicine specialist, and chairperson of Live, Love, Laugh, and Urmila Kanda, our brave hero for today, sharing her story of grief and also of hope.
My journey with mental health issues and grief began when my mother was diagnosed with cancer in 2020. And I realized that when you're caregiving, while all attention goes on the index patient in terms of medications, in terms of routine, in terms of diet, in terms of medical appointments, in terms of managing shift duties, but I think caregivers largely go unnoticed and mental health largely goes unsupported. The journey that I traveled with her during this ordeal and after her with the loss is one that has had a profound impact on me as a person. And I realized that grief is really a personal and immensely emotional experience that you can't fail to forget. But it is equally human. Adversity doesn't discriminate, but the stigma around mental health just makes it more difficult for us to open up and have those conversations.
Dr. Shyam, Urmila mentioned that her journey with loss, grief, and mental health started when she had to help her mother who was dealing with cancer. So let's start from there. How does one cope when one is taking care of a family member? In Urmila's case, of course, it was physical health. But even if somebody is looking after a family member's mental health, what can one do for their own well-being first?
Right, Sohila. You know, being a caregiver, whether it's for someone who's suffering from a physical illness or a mental illness, is something that can be extremely difficult and emotionally and physically exhausting for the caregiver. And you know, a popular metaphor that's useful to think about is that in the aircraft, they make an announcement that first put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on others. Let's start with basics, right? I mean, everyone needs to get enough sleep, get exercise, get some time off to spend on other things rather than focusing only on caregiving, eating right. These are very basic and you would think of as very simple things. But how many times is it that when someone is stressed or they're taking care of someone else, they forget to do these basic things for themselves? So that's really important because these are essential to protect your physical and mental health. And of course, if as a caregiver, you can at many times feel a lot of stress and anxiety yourself. And if the caregiver is experiencing that, then it's important to also talk to a therapist and get professional help if that's the case.
Urmila, you know, with your journey with your mom once she was diagnosed, and then I know she passed away soon after, can you tell me how you started dealing with your grief then?
Well, Sohila, I think no amount of preparation, even when a situation is consuming, can actually prepare us enough for one such moment. And I realized that when my mother passed away. So, some of the things that I consciously started doing in order to heal myself was like listening to aura cleansing beats, uh, trying to speak to friends who were caregivers in similar situations, reaching out to open networks. And still, there were days when my inner chaos exceeded my levels of resilience. I did speak to a therapist. I spoke to a therapist for quite a few times, and I think all of these things put together helped me cope up with grief. And I believe healing is a continuous process, and I'm still a part of the healing journey.
Urmila, did you ever feel when you were dealing with your grief that society was putting a certain pressure on you to heal faster or to get okay faster?
Absolutely, Sohila. I would say that most of the times when people come to meet us for the first time or have these conversations, they probably do not know how to respond. And so they just make statements like, be strong, move on, and things like that. And like it's been a week, or it's been a month, or it's been a year. But I think what's important is we do not put bereavement timelines to hop on the bus and say that we are all okay. It's okay to be not okay. So I've had my own high days and low days. There were days when I absolutely felt non productive. I lost my clarity of thought. But yes, one thing which I realized strongly throughout this journey, we really need to make a conscious effort to work through it and get back with hope to see things in a different way.
Right, Urmila, that's lovely. Getting back with hope is very important. Dr. Sham, now let me come to you. Can you help us understand exactly what grief is? Because grief can be felt over any kind of loss. And I am no one to judge that your loss is greater than my loss. So, what exactly is grief, and why is it that it hits people in different ways and people deal with it in different ways?
It's something that human beings as a species, we have to contend with this notion and this experience of loss. And there's nobody who is either not undergone loss or who is not going to undergo loss of some kind. And of course, grief is not, could be about bereavement, that is loss of a person, or the loss of a job, loss of status, loss of a relationship. So any loss triggers off a certain response, a certain reaction in mind and body, and that is what we call the grief response. So grief, of course, is felt differently by different people, but there are some of the things that people can experience while grieving, which include initially sometimes shock, sadness, numbness, a feeling. Sometimes people ask questions, should I be feeling this way, or should I not be crying right now? And people can start feeling guilty. There can be a lot of anger, either towards somebody else or sometimes towards themselves. And then it can lead to a state of sadness and isolation, a feeling of being disconnected from the world around them. And that can, of course, affect the way people eat, the way they sleep, whether they're taking care of themselves or not. But it's important to understand that this is a normal reaction to loss, and that it can take everyone's journey towards healing is quite different. But of course, in about 10% of cases, this can get prolonged, and in 5%, 2 to 5% of cases, it can become a mental issue, a mental health issue. And so it's also important to, in this journey, know when to get help if that is required. But what's important to understand for anyone grieving or anyone supporting people through grief is, A, there's no right or wrong way. Two, everyone's journey towards healing, everyone's experience of grief in that sense is different. And so what we must do is give ourselves the space to feel, or if your loved one is grieving, give themselves the space to talk, to feel supported.
Right, Dr. Sham, and you did say that there is no right or wrong way to grieve, but is there a healthy way to grieve?
Well, there are certain ways that are not going to be helpful. Certain things that people can do to dull their pain that are going to actually worsen the situation. One of the more common ways that people deal with grief is sometimes through substances. So drinking more or using any other substances to numb your pain, to numb the grief, is not healthy because it can actually worsen the pain. It is healthy to stay with feelings, to really allow yourself to experience what you're feeling without putting pressure on yourself to feel any one way or the other. It is useful to seek support and to seek out people you're close to who also share that loss, and to spend time with them. And so and it is, as we've discussed previously, it is healthy to take care of your daily needs, including sleep, exercise, and so on. So it's important also to recognize when one is grieving or a family member is grieving, that if the grief becomes prolonged to the extent that it's now causing severe dysfunction, for example, if a person is not able to function at all, they're avoiding all relationships, all conversations with close ones, or they have thoughts of that they would be better off joining the departed person, the person who has passed away, or they have thoughts of suicide. Now these are signs that the person should seek professional help, because the grief can, as I said, in a small percentage of cases actually become clinical depression.
And Urmila, you did mention that you also decided at some point that you wanted to go see a therapist. Can you tell me what you felt that made you realize that this might not be the normal process of grieving?
On some days, I really found my normal routine being challenging. I really found it difficult to do things which were otherwise part of my daily chores. For example, one of the days I went to buy some groceries and I forgot how to switch off the car. And I was literally struggling for a few minutes when my 10-year-old reminded me that, Mommy, this is how you have to switch it off. Why are you struggling? He probably didn't understand a lot, but I realized that it was time when I was deviating from my regular set of things, and I was actually finding it impossible to do even small things. And that's when I thought it's time I look after myself. I realized that I need to seek help, which is really professional and which can help me build an alternate set of perspectives and clear some of my patterns which might be otherwise blockers to my job.
That's amazing.
And I realized that
yes.
our stories matter more than what we think.
Our stories definitely matter, and telling our stories, which is what you're doing today, matters a lot, because you don't know where someone listening might be brave enough to take that step as well. And with that, it is time to take a break, but do come back as we continue this conversation on dealing with grief with Dr. Shyam Bhatt and Urmila Kantha.
When a profound event like a loss happens and you're processing grief in therapy, it's not just about recovering from the grief, it's also about understanding one's own nature.
Welcome back to Mind Matters, an invitation to well-being. Here we continue our conversation on dealing with the grief with the Dr. Shyam Bhatt and Urmila Kantha. Urmila, when you did decide to seek out therapy, what was your family's response? Because you'd just been through a major life incident, you'd lost a family member. I'm sure they were all grieving or mourning in their own way. And then, when you said that you wanted to seek therapy, did you get the support that you needed?
This is something which I have taken a step by myself. I did not discuss with anybody else because it was a help that I need. I felt that consulting a therapist would make a difference to me. And so I went ahead and just took help that I needed.
Tell me a little bit about that. Was it easy to find the right sort of therapist that you needed in that particular moment? And also, what was your relationship with the therapy? How did that go for you?
So I think when I decided to seek help and I did consult a therapist, initial couple of sessions felt like as if it was more like just venting out. I would be candid enough to say that it wasn't easy to really convince yourself that you're really deriving some value from the conversation. Because we as professionals are trained to think that everything comes with a timeline. If I have given 1 hour to therapy, it should have a return on value. Return on value in terms of time, return on value in terms of emotional comfort. I looked at alternatives and hopped on to employee assistance programs to seek out alternate therapists. But yes, I did not give up. And I think that was important.
That is the important thing. Dr. Shyam, Urmila raised something which is very important. How does one inculcate the patients to go through the process? Because mental health, just like physical health, sometimes requires patience. So how does one make sure that they see it through?
Sohila, as Urmila was saying, I think many people expect therapy to yield immediate and direct results. And when they find out that therapy is not that kind of journey, in the sense that the therapist doesn't often or usually tell you solutions to do this or do that, but rather therapy is a process of gradually peeling back the layers within one's own mind, the way one is responding, the narratives in the mind about what has happened, understanding one's own journey. Because, you know, as we were talking about grief, and we did say that that everybody experiences grief in their own personal way. Why is that? It's because we are all fundamentally different in the ways we grew up, the ideas we have, and how we hold things dear, how we respond to loss. And so when a profound event like a loss happens and you're processing grief in therapy, it's not just about recovering from the grief, it's also about understanding one's own nature. So the amount of self-awareness and insight that can come about from the process is profound, and that will ultimately be transformative for the individual. But that takes time. You know, in therapy, it does take time, because it will take you time sometimes to find the right therapist in terms of match. It can take time to establish rapport and a therapeutic relationship with the therapist. And then, because we're dealing often with subconscious material, not just conscious thoughts, that takes time to sort of get into. At the end of the day, whether you call someone's issue depression, anxiety, grief, stress, a relationship issue, it doesn't matter, because the voyage in therapy ultimately is the person discovering aspects of themselves that they did not understand, they did not know, they did not realize. And that helps people really become more resilient and unlocks their potential.
I think it sounds like we could all do with a little bit of therapy if that's what the end result could be, not just in the wake of a loss or grief or a traumatic life experience, which is when most people are likely to reach out. But Dr. Sham,
Absolutely.
you know, one thing which keeps coming out to me in our conversation is that when one decides to go seek therapy, you know, this transformation can happen. What if there is someone suffering because of not being able to deal with their grief, or not being able to deal with loss, or a general life experience, and they're suffering because of a change in their temperament, just not being happy, but they're not ready to seek out that help? I think this is very important because, you know, sometimes because of the stigma, sometimes because of inability to want to change, sometimes because of lack of time, sometimes because of financial constraints, people do not seek out the therapy they might necessarily need. What can we do in such a case?
This is an important question and a difficult situation, and one that's actually, unfortunately, all too common. Because that's still one of the biggest barriers, is just the sense that if I seek help for mental health, somehow that makes me, you know, there's something wrong with me, as opposed to if I go to a doctor for a physical issue. When it comes to our mental health, we take it, we feel obviously more personally about it, and therefore many people resist seeking help, both because of social shame and stigma, but also I think a deeper shame about it. And so the first step is to create a society where there's widespread knowledge that, look, we are, as you correctly said, Sohila, it's not, therapy is not just about treatment. I actually do think, and of course I'm biased, but I do think that all human beings in the contemporary world can use a form of therapy. It doesn't have to be with a therapist per se, but a form of therapy which is a form of inner exploration, because of the fact that as human beings we have such a unique brain and mind that, unlike any other animal species, we live in past and future, and so we can project out, you know, what might happen. And in that sense, we're never completely free of threat of loss. Even if we are not feeling loss right now, it could be projected out into the future. So therapy should be, in that sense, totally destigmatized, and in fact be, as you know, considered as important for one's health as like going to the gym, in my opinion. Now, secondly, but when in an individual case, when someone is suffering and they're clearly suffering, and the family member knows they're suffering but they're not getting the help, then it is a challenging situation. But here are some pointers. Firstly, for the family member to really form an even better relationship or a bond or an alliance with the person. The second thing is to really first start by reminding them why you love them and all the good qualities they have. Because the problem is, as soon as you say, let's get therapy, many people hear there's something wrong with me and I'm weak, or there's something deficient in me. So prefacing the conversation about therapy with first just a reminder of why you love the person, what do you love about the person, and all the great qualities that you see in the person. The next thing is to really communicate that, you know, that you're concerned about them. To say the statement in a way that is clear that it's about your concern about them, not accusing them of any behavior or anything that sounds like blame or criticism, but just to say, listen, I'm concerned about you. I see that you've been not eating for many days, or that you look sad for many days. How are you feeling? Get to a place where you can suggest something like, what would you feel about talking to somebody about this? And you could also share, if someone has been through, you've been through therapy, or a friend has been through therapy, you can talk to your loved one about that and tell them what the therapeutic process is like, and to totally normalize that. And then, of course, to suggest to them that they can get help, and that you will support them in that journey of seeking help. And it's also important to remember that this is not going to happen usually in one conversation. It might need multiple conversations. It's important not to lose your patience, not to back off, and to continue to be there, to listen to them, and to ask them, maybe you have other ideas about what will help you. You can share that with me and have that discussion as well. So it needs a lot of engagement, a lot of persistence, patience, and love to try to help that person get the professional help they need. But it's really important, and it can make a big difference in somebody's life.
Right. I'm a big believer in therapy, but the first thing is just acknowledging that I need to speak. Urmila, coming back to you now, you said that eventually you did go to your employees' welfare assistance. How did that work out for you, and how are you coping now?
So I think, Sohila, as I said, healing is a continuous process. It's a journey, and I definitely feel much better than I was feeling last year. So it's important to acknowledge how we are feeling. It's important to leverage all possible channels that offer help, and these are highly confidential, so they don't really advertise your problems. Another thing which has consciously helped me was reflective journaling. I have been passionate about writing. I mean, writing gives me an immense soul cleansing experience.
So the takeaway from this conversation is grieving is as individual as our lives, so it's important to give people the time they need to grieve without judgment. This small difference can go a long way. Dr. Shyam and Urmila, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sohila.
Thank you, Sohila.
And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Mind Matters, an invitation to well-being. Before we go, we do want to say that the bravest form of strength is vulnerability. So it's okay to say you're not okay.